thought we were celebrating. I thought the champagne Brenda had set out in crystal flutes meant that after 3 years of polite tension and holiday dinners held together by nothing but willpower and forced smiles, we were finally becoming something that resembled a real family. I had dressed carefully that evening, a soft gray blouse, the pearl earrings Jason had given me for our second anniversary, because I genuinely believed she was ready to accept me. I had no idea that while I was standing in front of my bathroom mirror choosing between silver and gold, my mother-in-law was sliding a manila folder onto her dining room table and rehearsing the speech she had spent 4 months perfecting. She didn't ask me to give my sister-in-law $50,000 toward an apartment. She announced it. She laid the folder open to a page I hadn't been invited to read and tapped a number circled in red pen with one manicured finger, and she said it the way you might mention splitting a restaurant bill. Casually, as if the answer were already decided, and all that remained was the formality of my agreement. The number was $50,000. The apartment was for Kayla, her 24-year-old daughter who had never held a job for longer than 6 months. And sitting directly across from me, his eyes on his untouched glass of champagne, was my husband Jason. He didn't say a word. Let me tell you about the life I had built before that evening, because you need to understand what was at stake. Not just the money, but the meaning behind it. You need to understand what it cost me to get to a place where $50,000 was even a number I could write without my hands shaking. I grew up in a house where money was always the subject of the argument you weren't supposed to overhear. My parents fought about it through thin walls, around dinner tables, in the car with the radio turned up just loud enough to almost cover their voices. My father worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood and still somehow never felt like it was enough. My mother clipped coupons with the focus of a surgeon and called it being smart, but I could see the exhaustion behind her eyes when she thought no one was looking. I made a promise to myself somewhere around the age of 12, sitting in our yellow kitchen while my mother counted change into a jar on the counter, that I would never feel that way. I would never feel that particular flavor of helplessness, that specific shade of panic that comes from not having enough. I would build something solid, something no one could take from me. It took me 11 years. I finished my computer science degree in 3.5 years instead of 4, working weekends at a tech support desk to cover what my partial scholarship didn't. I took every freelance project I could find during the last 2 years of university. Websites for small businesses, database cleanups for local firms, anything that paid. By the time I graduated, I already had enough saved for a down payment on a small studio apartment on the east side of the city. I lived there for 4 years, barely, eating a lot of pasta and rice, saying no to vacations and new clothes and anything that didn't directly contribute to the plan. When I was 28, I sold it and bought a proper 1-bedroom in a building with a working elevator and a view that made me cry the first time I stood at the window. Not because it was extravagant. It wasn't. It was a quiet, clean 2-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood with floors I had chosen myself and a kitchen that smelled of the rosemary plant I kept on the windowsill. But it was mine. Entirely, completely, legally mine. My name on every document, my signature on every line. Jason came into my life 6 months after I bought it. We met at a work conference. He was in project management for a construction firm. I was consulting for one of their software vendors. And he had this quality I found immediately disarming. He was completely, almost aggressively calm. Where I was wired tight and always half thinking about the next problem, Jason moved through the world like someone who had made peace with it. He laughed easily. He remembered details about people. He once spent 45 minutes helping a stranger change a tire in the rain and showed up to our 3rd date soaked to the knees and entirely unbothered. I loved him for that. I loved the way he made me feel like the future was not something to be anxious about, but something to look forward to. He told me about his family in pieces, the way you do when you already know the picture isn't entirely flattering. His mother, Brenda, had raised him and his younger sister, Kayla, largely alone after his father left when Jason was 14. She'd worked hard, he said. She'd sacrificed. She had made it clear in 100 small ways that those sacrifices were a debt her children would carry. His father, a man named Gerald, had left not just the family, but the country, remarrying and settling somewhere in Portugal, which Brenda referenced with a particular tight smile whenever money was discussed. Jason loved his mother. I could see that plainly. But there was something else in the way he talked about her. A careful, measured quality. like a man describing a landscape he has learned to navigate without looking down. Kayla. I met at Christmas that first year. She was 21 then, pretty and soft-edged and wrapped in an aura of mild entitlement that I recognized but did not immediately flag as dangerous. She borrowed things and didn't return them. She arrived an hour late to family dinners and sat down as if she were doing everyone a favor. She had opinions about my apartment. She called it cute. The way people say cute when they mean small, and she wandered through the rooms touching things and asking what I'd paid for them with the bluntness of someone who has never been told that is not an appropriate question. I put it down to youth and moved on. Brenda was something else entirely. She was 62, slim, always dressed as if company might arrive at any moment. She wore her gray hair in a precise bob, and she had a gift for a certain kind of compliment that left you faintly unsettled. The kind that arrives wrapped in warmth, but carries a barb somewhere in its center that you only find later, turning the words over in your mind at night. She told me once, about 8 months into my relationship with Jason, that she admired how independent I was, and the way she said the word made it sound vaguely like a character flaw. She asked about my apartment every time I saw her. Not about me, not about my work, not about how Jason and I were doing. The apartment. How was the building? Had I considered upgrading? Was the neighborhood still good? The questions were always gentle, always framed as interest, and I always answered them the way I answered all of Brenda's questions, carefully, briefly, giving nothing away. Jason and I married in the spring of the 3rd year. It was a small wedding because I wanted a small wedding, and because the money we might have spent on something larger went into a joint savings account instead. I did not add Jason's name to the apartment. This was a decision I made quietly, without drama, and it was not about trust. It was about the promise I had made that 12-year-old girl in the yellow kitchen. My name on every document, my signature on every line. What was mine would remain mine. We talked about it once, briefly, and Jason said he understood completely, and I believed him. I still believe he understood. Understanding something and making peace with it are two different things. The first 6 months of our marriage were good, genuinely good. We fell into rhythms that surprised me with how easy they were. Saturday mornings with coffee and the farmer's market 3 blocks away, Sunday evenings, cooking something complicated together in the kitchen while music played too loud. Jason had a habit of narrating what he was doing while he cooked, a low running commentary on the state of the garlic or the temperature of the oil, and I found it unbearably endearing. We talked about the future in terms that felt real and close, a bigger place eventually, maybe a dog, a trip to Japan that we had been planning and postponing for 2 years. I was happy in a way that felt earned, the way things feel when you've worked for them honestly. It was in the 7th month that things began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. The first thing I noticed was the phone calls. Not that Jason was making them. He was always on his phone, talking to contractors, to his project manager, to his old university friends who scattered themselves across the conversation like familiar furniture. But the quality of certain calls changed. There were calls he took in the hallway, the door half pulled behind him, his voice dropping to a register I couldn't quite catch from the kitchen. Calls that ended before I entered the room, a particular silence following me as I walked in and found him already putting the phone in his pocket. I noticed it the way you notice a draft before you find the open window, a general sense of something wrong before the specific fact of it. The second thing was Brenda's interest in the apartment, which sharpened from its usual ambient nosiness into something more pointed. She came to dinner in our 3rd month of marriage and spent an extended, peculiar amount of time examining the kitchen, running her hand along the countertop, looking out the window with her head tilted at a considering angle. She asked me what I thought the apartment was worth now, given how much the neighborhood had changed. I said I didn't really think about it that way. It wasn't something I intended to sell. She smiled and said, "Of course not, of course not," and moved on, and I filed it under Brenda being Brenda. But later that night, brushing my teeth, I replayed the way she'd looked at the kitchen window, like someone assessing. Kayla, around this time, started coming up in conversation more, not in the casual, passing way of family gossip, but with a focused frequency that I began to notice. Jason would mention that Kayla was struggling with her rent, that Kayla had lost another job through no fault of her own, he was careful to add, that Kayla deserved something stable, something she could build from. I agreed with this in the vague, non-committal way one agrees with statements that are not really statements, but are actually the first careful soundings of something larger. I did not yet understand that these conversations were rehearsals. One evening in early November, almost 7 months into our marriage, I came home to find Jason and Brenda at the kitchen table. This was not unusual. Brenda had a standing invitation to visit whenever she liked, which was something I had agreed to and occasionally regretted. What was unusual was the way they both looked up at the same time when I walked in, a fraction of a second's pause in whatever they'd been saying, a shared stillness so brief it was almost not there. I set my bag down and said hello. Brenda said hello back and immediately began asking me about my day with the warm, focused attention of someone who has just changed the subject. Jason poured me a glass of wine and asked about the project I'd been working on. It was seamless. It was practiced. I said nothing. I poured my wine and answered the questions and sat at my own kitchen table feeling, for the first time in my marriage, like a guest. That night, lying in the dark while Jason's breathing evened beside me, I stared at the ceiling and had the thought I would spend the next 3 weeks trying to dismiss. He is helping her plan something. I didn't know what. I didn't know how far it had gone. But the thought sat there in the dark, solid and specific, and no amount of rational explanation made it leave. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was reading too much into coincidence. I told myself that Jason loved me and that Brenda was difficult but not malevolent, and that marriages had friction and that friction was not betrayal. I told myself all of this, and I almost believed it, right up until the evening 4 weeks later when I found the folder. It was a Thursday. Jason was at a site inspection that was running late. He'd texted me at 5 to say he'd be home by 7, maybe 7:30. I was working from home that day, finishing a system audit report, and by 6 o'clock my eyes were burning and I needed a break. I went to make tea, and on the way back to my desk I stopped at the small table near the front door where we kept our keys and mail and the casual debris of daily life. There was a folder there that I hadn't seen before, cream-colored, the kind with a little metal clasp, the kind that means something official. I assumed it was something of Jason's from work. Construction projects generated endless paper. I nearly walked past it. What stopped me was the tab. It was a small sticky tab, the kind you use to mark pages, and it was bright orange, and on it, in Brenda's handwriting, I had seen her handwriting on birthday cards for 3 years, that particular tight, upright script, was written one word, Clara, my name. My hands did not shake yet. I remember that clearly. I was still in the part before understanding, the last quiet moment before the ground shifts, and I picked up the folder the way you pick up any ordinary object, and I opened the clasp and took out the first page and I read it. It was a property valuation for my apartment. Detailed, precise, conducted by a licensed assessor whose business card was paper-clipped to the upper corner. The valuation was dated 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, while I had been sitting in the same apartment working and cooking dinner and sleeping beside my husband, someone had paid a licensed assessor to calculate exactly what my home was worth on the open market. I turned to the second page. My legs had gone strange, that particular lightness you get when the blood has somewhere better to be. And I sat down on the floor right there, cross-legged on the hallway tiles, the folder across my knees. The second page was a handwritten document, not typed, and I recognized Jason's handwriting alongside Brenda's in the margins. It was a proposal. That is the only word for it. A formal, structured proposal, with paragraphs numbered and subclauses indented, outlining a plan for Clara's apartment, to be either sold or refinanced in order to release equity, the proceeds of which would be used to purchase a new apartment for Kayla. The amount cited was $50,000 as a minimum contribution, with a note in Jason's handwriting that said, "She won't go below this. Best approach, frame as family gift, present at dinner." I read it 3 times. I read it until the words stopped moving and arranged themselves into the only meaning they had, which was this. My husband had helped his mother build a case for taking my money, my home, the thing I had given 11 years of my life to build. He had attended meetings I didn't know about, had conversations I wasn't part of, had written notes in the margins of a document with his mother's handwriting, and he had decided, at some point between the Saturday mornings at the farmer's market and the Sunday evenings with the loud music and the runny commentary about the garlic, that my financial security was something that could be negotiated. The ticking of the hallway clock was very loud. Outside, a car passed. Someone in the apartment above mine was moving furniture, a heavy scraping sound that went on for a few seconds and then stopped. I sat on the cold floor, and I held the folder, and I tried to locate some emotion large enough for the size of what I was holding, and what I found was not rage, not grief, but something far colder and more precise. The feeling of a woman who has just been handed the complete picture after spending weeks trying to understand a partial one. The feeling of terrible crystalline clarity. I put the pages back. I closed the clasp. I placed the folder exactly as I had found it, at the same angle, with the tab facing the same way. Then I stood up and walked back to my desk, and I sat down and I looked at my reflection in the dark monitor, and I said quietly to myself, "Okay, I see it now." I did not confront Jason that evening. This required more self-control than I am proud of, but I had made a decision, standing in the hallway with the cold tile through my socks and my heart doing something violent in my chest, that I would not move without understanding the full shape of what I was dealing with. I needed to know how far it had gone, who was involved, what they had planned. Emotion could come later. Right now, I needed information. When Jason came home at 7:45, I had dinner on the stove and wine already poured and the folder untouched on the table by the door. I watched him glance at it as he hung up his coat. A quick, practiced glance, the kind that checks whether something is where it was left, that registers its continued presence with relief. He turned to me and kissed me and said he was sorry he was late and asked how the report was going, and I smiled and said fine and asked about the site inspection, and we sat down to dinner and talked about his day and his colleagues and a problem with a supplier in the north, and I watched his face the entire time. The ease of it, the familiar landscape of it, the face of a man who does not know he has already been found out. He was a better actor than I had given him credit for, or perhaps he had always worn this face, and I had simply never had reason to look beneath it. After dinner, after the dishes, after Jason had settled onto the couch with his phone and I had retreated to the bedroom with my laptop, I opened a new browser window and I searched for the name of a family law attorney whose card a colleague had pressed on me 8 months ago, laughing, saying, "You won't need this, but just in case." I had kept it because I never throw things like that away. I sent the attorney a brief email, subject line, "Urgent consultation request." Body, I need to understand my rights regarding jointly occupied separately owned property and potential financial coercion. I pressed send and closed the laptop and lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling and waited to feel something other than that cold, purposeful clarity. I waited a long time. The dinner that Brenda had planned, the champagne, the candlelight, the folder on the dining room table, was scheduled for the following Saturday. I had 4 days. The attorney's name was Patricia Wills, and she called me back the next morning before 9. Her voice was brisk and direct, the voice of someone who has heard everything and stopped being surprised by any of it. I told her the situation in 4 minutes, the folder, the valuation, the handwritten proposal, Jason's notes in the margins. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Is your name the sole name on the title deed?" "Yes," I told her, "always." "Have you signed anything in the last year relating to the property?" "No." "Good. You're in a strong position. Come see me Monday and photograph every page of that folder before the dinner." I photographed every page that afternoon, front and back, uploaded them to cloud storage under a folder I named, with deliberate plainness, evidence. I told no one. I moved through those 4 days with the controlled calm of someone disarming a device they don't fully understand. I went to work. I cooked dinner, I laughed at Jason's jokes and slept beside him and waited. He was tense in the car on the way to Brenda's that Saturday. Hands on the wheel, even on straight roads, radio off. He was managing me, getting me calm enough to deliver me through the front door. I found this, in a distant way, deeply sad. Brenda opened the door in her cream blouse and good pearl necklace. The table was set for 4, champagne already poured, the matching folder open at her place setting, angled precisely. Kayla was already seated, phone face down on the tablecloth, a performance of attentiveness clearly rehearsed for the occasion. Her perfume hit me the moment I stepped inside. Heavy florals, a smell I would forever after associate with this room and this particular form of calculated warmth. She opened with gratitude, a catalog of sacrifices delivered with dignity, the years raising 2 children alone, the choices she'd made, the ones she hadn't been given. She spoke about Kayla's difficulties, the jobs, the circumstances, none of which, it was gently implied, were Kayla's fault. She said family 11 times. I counted. Then she turned the folder to face me. The number at the top was circled in red pen, $50,000. $50,000, I said. My voice came out perfectly level. Is that the number you agreed on? Brenda tilted her head. We think it's very reasonable. I'm asking Jason. The silence that followed had a texture. Kayla's performed hope flickered into something more guarded. Jason finally raised his eyes from his glass, and I watched him calculate. The careful, practiced calculation of a man who has tried to maintain 2 separate truths and is now watching them collide in a room too small to contain them both. Maybe we could just hear what Mom has to say, he said carefully. You wrote notes on this document, I said. I've seen the original, your handwriting. She won't go below this. Best approach, frame as family gift, present at dinner. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. How long have you been part of planning this? He looked at the table. His jaw worked. Jason, how long? 3 months. The words came out flat and quiet, the weight of a confession that has stopped caring about outcome. Mom brought it up, and I thought it would stay theoretical. But you wrote notes on a proposal document. I know. You let a stranger into our apartment to assess it without telling me. Clara. Without asking me. Without once suggesting in 3 months that this was not something you were entitled to do. His silence was the loudest thing in the room. It was Brenda who recovered first. She pivoted without visible seam, her expression shifting from confident warmth to grieved concern. You're being very dramatic, she said, her voice cooling several degrees. This is a family conversation. No one has done anything wrong. You're perfectly free to decline, and then we can have dinner and move on. She paused, and then added with the calm assurance of someone delivering a card they have been saving. Though you should know we've spoken to our own solicitor. The laws around marital assets aren't as clear-cut as you might believe. You live together in that apartment. It functions as a marital home. There are arguments. Stop. I picked up my phone. I had placed it on the table when I sat down, face up, because I had known this moment was coming. I turned the screen toward the room. My attorney's name at the top, her summary below in clear numbered points. My name is the sole name on the title deed. The property predates this marriage by 4 years, funded entirely by premarital assets I can document going back 11 years. My solicitor's assessment is that any claim would fail. I set the phone down. You already knew this. That's why the proposal says family gift instead of legal claim. You couldn't take it, so you planned to make me give it. Brenda was very still. Did you think I would say yes? I said. Or did you think you could make me feel guilty enough to eventually say yes? She didn't answer, which was its own answer. I left before dinner. Jason followed me to the car, saying my name in the rain. I stood by the door and looked at him, his face familiar and suddenly strange, and felt something between love and grief, the particular sorrow of a woman who has just seen clearly the shape of a man she married. Not a villain, something harder. A man of real affection whose love for his mother had curdled over years into a willingness to keep secrets that were not his to keep. I need you to go back inside, I said. I'm going home. We'll talk tomorrow. I drove home through the rain and did not cry until I was inside with the door locked, and when I did, it was brief and functional, the body making room for what comes next. Dana arrived within the hour. She looked at my face and understood this was not a wine and comfort evening, but a plan and strategize evening. When I finished walking her through everything, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Gerald. I looked at her. What about him? Have you ever actually talked to Jason's father? Not heard about him through Brenda, actually spoken to him. She leaned forward. My mother was friends with Gerald's sister, years ago. She mentioned once that when Brenda and Gerald divorced, the settlement was significant, that Brenda had done quite well out of it and had been very strategic. She paused. That woman has money, Clara, more than she's ever admitted to having. The room felt very still. I remembered Brenda's words. You have the means. You could refinance easily. You'd barely feel it. The assurance of someone who knew the numbers precisely. I opened my laptop. Find me Gerald's contact information, I said. I spoke to Gerald the next morning. He was in Lisbon, cautious at first, the caution of a man who has learned to be careful about his former life. But when I explained what had happened, the caution dissolved into quiet, precise anger. He confirmed the settlement. $140,000 in assets, plus the house. The story of the woman who had sacrificed everything raising children alone had always had a significant, deliberately omitted footnote. He also told me about a savings account in Kayla's name that he had set up before the divorce. $60,000. Kayla didn't know about it. He never told Jason because by the time he left, Jason had already decided what kind of man his father was. I thanked him. I wrote down everything. I had 3 pieces of information now that no one in that dining room knew I possessed. On Monday, I walked into Patricia Will's office, and my attorney looked at the full picture spread across her desk and said with the economy of a woman who measures her words like currency, "You're ready." The confrontation I chose was not private. I allowed Jason to invite the wider family to Sunday lunch at Brenda's, the aunt, 2 cousins, the family friend who had known them 30 years. I told Jason only that I wanted to talk things through. He was visibly relieved. He did not know what I had spent 2 weeks building. I let Brenda open with her softer pitch, the language of reconciliation, photographs of apartments shortlisted for Kayla, the careful performance of a woman offering a fresh start. She was good at modulating. I gave her that every time. Then I placed 3 documents on the table. The original proposal, the property valuation stamped with the assessor's name and the date, and a letter from Patricia outlining the precise circumstances under which a legally actionable claim of financial coercion could be made, and what the consequences might be for the individuals named, individuals whose names were already in documents my attorney held. I haven't filed anything, I said clearly, for the room. What I've done is ensure there is a complete record of everything that has happened in the last 4 months, every document, every meeting, everything that was planned. I looked at Brenda steadily, including the savings account in Kayla's name, the one with approximately $60,000 in it. The color that left Brenda's face was something I will never forget. In the 30 seconds of silence that followed, I watched the performance dissolve entirely. The warm, composed face of the woman who was only trying to help falling away into something older and more exposed. Kayla turned to her mother. "What savings account?" Jason said very quietly. "Mom." The aunt set her teacup down on its saucer with a small, precise click. What followed was messier and more human than triumph. Brenda denied the account, then minimized it, then reframed it as money saved for the right moment. Kayla cried, genuinely I think, because discovering that her mother had been sitting on $60,000 while asking her brother's wife to fund her stability was a wound that had nothing to do with me. Jason said almost nothing for the rest of the afternoon. When we were home, he sat on the couch and put his face in his hands and stayed there for a long time. We separated 4 months later, not that evening, but after 4 months of honest and painful conversations that led us both from different directions to the same conclusion. He was not a villain. He was a man whose love for his mother had become, over years, a willingness to keep secrets that were not his to keep. That was not something we could build from. We both knew it by January. The apartment remained mine. Patricia sent 1 letter to Brenda's solicitor. Nothing further came of it. Kayla, I heard months later through Jason's cousin, had a long and difficult conversation with her mother. Whether it changed anything between them was not mine to know. It is autumn now. I am sitting on my balcony with coffee I made too strong and a blanket across my knees because the mornings have turned cold. The rosemary on the windowsill is still alive, which continues to surprise me. Dana is coming for dinner tonight. My father called yesterday, and when I told him most of it, finally, he was quiet in the way he gets when something makes him proud and sad at the same time. Then he said, "You sound like your mother." I knew it was the highest thing he knew how to offer. There are things I lost that I will not pretend were small. The marriage I thought I had, the future I had sketched, the clean, simple rhythm of two people building something together. Those losses are true. I carry them, but I am still here, on my balcony in the autumn light, in possession of everything I built, still in possession of my own life. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything.